Have you ever given your loyalty, your time, and your genuine care to someone, only to feel like it was never truly valued? You showed up when she needed you. You listened when she had problems. You tried to build something real while the world around you seemed full of temporary connections. And yet, somehow, the more consistent you were, the more invisible your effort became. Until one day, you stopped. You stopped chasing. You stopped explaining. You stopped trying to convince someone to see your worth. And strangely enough, that was the moment everything began to change. Because there is a painful truth many men eventually learn in love. Some people will never recognize your value while you are still standing beside them. They only begin to understand what you meant to their life after you walk away. And when that realization finally arrives, it often comes with a question that cannot be undone. Did I lose someone I should have appreciated? Welcome to the channel, Stoic Love Wisdom. This is where we will learn, explore, and share valuable lessons about love. In today's video, I will reveal to you, she doesn't appreciate your value, until you leave, a new perspective, helping you better understand the factors that determine a happy and sustainable relationship. Let's explore with me the secrets to building a strong and meaningful love. Before we start, find a quiet place, put on your headphones and relax. Let all your worries melt away, and let the messages in this video help you calm down and feel the most complete. Are you ready? Let's start now. Part 1, The Silent Tragedy of Being Unappreciated. There is a quiet kind of pain that many men carry, but rarely speak about. It is not the pain of rejection. Rejection is clear. It is honest. It is immediate. The deeper pain is being present, giving your best, loving sincerely, and still not being valued. Many men know this story. You show up. You invest your time. You give your loyalty. You listen when she speaks. You support her when she struggles. You try to be patient, understanding, and dependable. And yet somehow, your presence slowly becomes ordinary in her eyes. Your effort becomes expected. Your loyalty becomes invisible. And what hurts the most is this. The very things that once made her admire you eventually become things she simply assumes will always be there. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of relationships. The more consistently you give, the more easily people forget the value of what they are receiving. Not because they are evil. Not because they consciously want to hurt you. But because human nature often fails to recognize value until the possibility of loss appears. The Stoics understood this long ago. They believed that attachment without awareness leads to suffering. Not because love is wrong, but because expecting appreciation from someone who has grown accustomed to your presence is a dangerous illusion. And this is where many men lose themselves. They start adjusting. Trying harder. Giving more. Explaining themselves more clearly. Being more patient. Being more understanding. They believe that if they just prove their value enough, eventually she will realize it. But here is the difficult truth most men must learn the hard way. Value cannot be negotiated through effort alone. Value is not something you beg others to see. It is something they either recognize or only understand after it disappears. Think about how often this happens. When you were always available, she replied slowly. When you always made time for her, she sometimes canceled. When you gave emotional support, she treated it casually. But the moment your attention begins to fade, the moment your presence becomes less certain, suddenly, something changes. She notices. She becomes curious. She starts wondering what happened. Not because you suddenly became valuable overnight, but because the possibility of losing you awakens awareness. The Stoic philosophers would say this is a natural law of perception. People rarely examine what feels permanent. But they immediately notice what might vanish. This is why distance often creates clarity. And this is why many women begin to recognize a man's worth only when he begins to walk away. But before we go further, let us clarify something important. Walking away is not a strategy to manipulate someone. It is not a trick to make her chase you. That is childish thinking. A man grounded in Stoic principles does not leave to provoke a reaction. He leaves because he finally understands something fundamental. A relationship where your value must constantly be proven is already imbalanced. Real appreciation does not require endless demonstration. It flows naturally from mutual respect. When a woman truly values you, she does not treat your presence like background noise. She notices your effort. She protects the connection. She respects your time and your energy. But when appreciation is absent, something dangerous begins to happen. You slowly start abandoning yourself. You tolerate things that once felt unacceptable. You become quieter. You ignore your own needs. You compromise your standards. Not because you are weak, but because you hope that patience will eventually restore harmony. This is where many good men make their biggest mistake. They confuse endurance with strength. They believe that staying longer proves loyalty. They believe that tolerating neglect proves love. But Stoic philosophy teaches something different. True strength is not measured by how much disrespect you can endure. True strength is measured by how firmly you remain aligned with your own values. A man who respects himself does not beg to be appreciated. He does not compete for emotional recognition. And he certainly does not shrink himself just to maintain someone else's comfort. Instead, he observes. He reflects. He gives space for awareness. And when necessary, he walks away quietly. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. But with dignity. Because he understands something that many people realize far too late. Presence is a gift. Your time is a gift. Your loyalty is a gift. Your attention is a gift. And gifts that are treated carelessly are eventually withdrawn. The moment a man truly understands this, everything begins to change. He stops chasing validation. He stops over-explaining his intentions. He stops exhausting himself trying to convince someone of his worth. Instead, he becomes calm. More selective. More observant. And strangely enough, that calmness is often when the other person finally begins to notice what they once ignored. But by that time, the dynamic has already shifted. Because a man who has rediscovered his self-respect is no longer operating from the same place of emotional dependency. He has stepped back. He has regained perspective. And he now understands something that every experienced man eventually learns. Not everyone who enters your life is capable of recognizing your value while you are still there. Some people only understand your importance when your absence creates silence. And that silence speaks louder than all the effort you once gave. This is where the real story begins. Because when a man finally decides to leave a place where he was not truly valued, something fascinating happens. The same presence that once felt ordinary becomes extraordinary in hindsight. The same loyalty that once felt expected becomes rare in memory. And the same man who was once taken for granted becomes someone she suddenly begins to understand. But by then, the man she once overlooked is no longer standing in the same place. And that realization is where regret often begins. Love is not always about brilliant moments, but often about patience, listening and accompanying in every small step. It is those simple things that nurture a lasting bond. That is also the reason why I believe that every experience in love is an opportunity for us to grow and become stronger. If you feel this, please click like as a way to spread positivity to more people. And if this is your first time visiting our channel, click subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any lessons. I also look forward to hearing your thoughts. What is the smallest but most meaningful thing you have ever realized in love? Leave a comment below, maybe your answer will become a source of inspiration for others. Now, let's continue our journey to explore deeper perspectives right away. Part 2, Why she only realizes your value after you leave. There is a strange pattern that repeats itself in many relationships. While you are there, consistent, loyal, dependable, your presence slowly becomes part of the background of her life. Like the air in a room. Necessary, but unnoticed. And the more stable you are, the more predictable you become. You answer her messages. You show up when she needs support. You make time when she asks. You listen when she talks about her struggles. You forgive when she has a bad day. At first, she appreciates it. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. Your consistency begins to feel normal. Your effort begins to feel automatic. Your patience begins to feel expected. This is not always intentional. It is simply a reflection of human psychology. The mind quickly adapts to stability. What once felt special slowly becomes the new normal. The Stoics understood this very well. They called it a form of unconscious attachment to certainty. When something feels guaranteed, the mind stops examining its value. Think about this for a moment. If someone brings you water every day, eventually you stop thanking them. Not because water is not valuable, but because the mind quietly assumes it will always be there. This is exactly what happens in many relationships. A man who gives too consistently without boundaries unknowingly teaches the other person something dangerous. That his presence is permanent. And when people believe something is permanent, they stop protecting it. They stop nurturing it. They stop appreciating it. Not out of cruelty, but out of familiarity. Familiarity dulls perception. And perception is what creates appreciation. This is why absence has such a powerful psychological effect. When you remove your presence, something important disappears from her emotional environment. The silence becomes noticeable. The attention she once received without effort is suddenly gone. The emotional safety she once leaned on is no longer automatic. And the mind begins to ask questions it never asked before. Why is he different now? Why isn't he reaching out? Why does it suddenly feel quieter? This moment is where awareness begins. Not because she suddenly changed as a person, but because the human mind only analyzes what feels uncertain. The Stoics believe that uncertainty forces reflection. When something might be lost, its importance suddenly becomes visible. And this is why many women only begin to evaluate a man's value when he starts pulling away. They notice the change. They feel the absence. And suddenly they begin replaying memories. Moments they once overlooked now feel meaningful. Conversations they once dismissed now feel important. The effort they once took for granted now feels rare. But here is the uncomfortable truth. By the time this realization begins, the man has already started evolving beyond the relationship. Because walking away is rarely an impulsive decision. Most men do not leave the moment they feel unappreciated. They try first. They communicate. They give more patience. They wait for things to improve. They convince themselves that maybe it is just a phase. But eventually, there comes a moment when something inside them shifts. A quiet realization. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just clear. They begin to understand that their presence is no longer being respected. And the moment a man truly accepts that reality, his emotional investment slowly begins to withdraw. Not out of revenge. Not out of anger. But out of self-preservation. Stoic philosophy teaches that a wise man must learn the difference between commitment and attachment. Commitment is healthy. Attachment that ignores self-respect is destructive. And when a man starts reclaiming his self-respect, his behavior naturally changes. He becomes calmer, less reactive, less available for emotional chaos. He stops chasing explanations. He stops trying to prove his intentions. He stops fighting to maintain something that no longer feels balanced. And ironically, this is the exact moment when many women finally begin to feel something shifting. Because the man they once assumed would always be there is no longer behaving the same way. His attention becomes rare. His silence becomes noticeable. His absence becomes real. And the mind begins filling that silence with questions. This is not manipulation. It is simply the psychological impact of contrast. Humans notice change more than stability. And when the man who once gave constant presence becomes distant, that contrast becomes powerful. But something else also begins happening inside the woman. Curiosity. Curiosity is one of the strongest emotional triggers in human behavior. She begins wondering what caused the change. Did he lose interest? Did he meet someone else? Did she push him too far? And with each unanswered question, her mind begins reevaluating the relationship. This is where appreciation often begins to grow. Because the mind is now forced to examine something it previously ignored. But here is the deeper layer that many people misunderstand. When a woman begins realizing your value after you leave, she is not just reacting to your absence. She is reacting to the shift in your energy. A man who stops chasing approval carries a different presence. His silence becomes stronger. His independence becomes noticeable. His emotional self-control becomes attractive. This is deeply aligned with Stoic philosophy. The Stoics believe that a man becomes most powerful when he is no longer controlled by the need for external validation. When he becomes centered within himself, his behavior changes naturally. He no longer seeks attention. And paradoxically, that independence often draws attention. But by this stage, something important has already changed inside the man. He has stepped back enough to see the relationship clearly. He begins recognizing patterns he once ignored. Moments where he was dismissed. Times where his effort went unnoticed. Situations where his patience was mistaken for weakness. And once clarity appears, it is difficult to return to the same emotional blindness. This is why many men do not come back the same way they once were. Not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves as well. And that shift creates a new dynamic. Because the man who once gave endless access is now selective with his presence. The man who once explained everything now speaks less. The man who once chased harmony now protects his peace. And strangely enough, that is when many women begin to feel something they did not feel before. Respect. Not because he demanded it, but because he finally embodied it. And respect, once awakened, changes everything. But this realization often comes late. Sometimes too late. Because when a man truly learns the lesson of self-respect, he rarely returns to the same version of himself that was once taken for granted. And that is where the real turning point begins. Because walking away does more than create absence. It creates transformation. And transformation is what changes the entire story. Part 3, the moment a man stops chasing and starts choosing himself. There comes a quiet moment in a man's life that few people notice. It is not dramatic. There are no arguments. No grand speeches. No slammed doors. Just a quiet shift inside his mind. A moment where he finally stops asking one question. Why isn't she valuing me? And starts asking a completely different one. Why am I staying where I am not valued? That single question changes everything. Because the moment a man asks himself this honestly, he begins to see things he ignored before. He remembers the times he explained himself over and over again. The moments he tried to be patient while his effort went unnoticed. The days he adjusted his plans just to make her comfortable. The nights he stayed awake thinking about how to fix a connection that only he seemed to be maintaining. At the time, he told himself it was love. But slowly he begins to realize something deeper. It wasn't only love. It was also attachment. Attachment to the idea of the relationship. Attachment to the memories of how things once felt. Attachment to the hope that if he just gave a little more, things would return to what they once were. But the Stoics had a powerful warning about attachment. They believe that attachment to things outside our control is one of the fastest ways to lose inner peace. Because the moment your emotional stability depends entirely on someone else's behavior, you have unknowingly handed over your power. And many men do exactly that in relationships. They give their time, their patience, their emotional energy, their loyalty. But somewhere along the way, they also give away something much more valuable. Their sense of self-worth. They begin measuring their value based on how the other person treats them. If she is warm, they feel secure. If she becomes distant, they feel anxious. If she praises them, they feel confident. If she withdraws, they feel inadequate. This emotional dependence slowly traps them in a cycle where they are constantly trying to earn back stability. But the moment a man wakes up from this pattern, something powerful happens. He stops chasing emotional validation. He starts rebuilding internal validation. This is one of the central ideas of Stoic philosophy. A Stoic man does not depend on the approval of others to define his worth. He defines it through his own character. Through his discipline. Through his values. Through his actions. And when a man begins returning to this mindset, his entire presence begins to change. He becomes calmer. Not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because he stops exhausting himself trying to control what he cannot control. He no longer tries to force appreciation. He no longer tries to convince someone of his value. He understands something simple but powerful. The right people will recognize your value without constant explanation. And the wrong people will ignore it no matter how much you try to prove it. Once a man understands this truth, he begins reclaiming parts of himself he had slowly neglected. He reconnects with his goals, his ambitions, his personal growth, the hobbies he once abandoned, the friendships he once postponed, the dreams he once delayed. He begins investing that emotional energy back into his own life. And this is where something interesting happens. The more he focuses on his own growth, the less he feels the need to chase someone who could not see his value. This is not bitterness. This is clarity. Because a man who chooses himself is not rejecting love. He is rejecting imbalanced love. Love where effort flows in only one direction. Love where patience becomes a one-sided obligation. Love where presence is taken for granted. And when a man begins stepping out of that dynamic, his energy becomes different. He walks differently. He speaks differently. He carries himself with a quiet confidence. Not loud arrogance. Not emotional coldness. Just calm self-respect. And this type of presence is incredibly noticeable. Even to the person who once overlooked him. Because when someone stops chasing you, you immediately feel the shift. The messages become less frequent. The attention becomes less predictable. The emotional availability becomes limited. Suddenly, the man who once seemed always available is no longer orbiting around her life. And that absence creates a strange emotional reaction. At first, confusion. Then curiosity. Then sometimes even anxiety. Because the dynamic that once felt stable has changed. And humans are deeply sensitive to changes in emotional patterns. She may start wondering. Why is he different now? Why does he seem so calm? Why isn't he trying to fix things anymore? But what she is really noticing is not distance. She is noticing self-respect. A man who has stopped chasing approval becomes incredibly difficult to manipulate emotionally. Not because he becomes cold, but because he becomes grounded. His happiness no longer depends on whether someone appreciates him today or ignores him tomorrow. And this stability is something many people find deeply intriguing. Because true emotional independence is rare. But here is the deeper truth. When a man reaches this stage, something important has already changed inside him. He has already begun detaching from the old emotional patterns. He has already accepted that not every connection is meant to last forever. And he has already made peace with the idea that sometimes the healthiest choice is simply to move forward. This acceptance is what the Stoics called inner freedom. Freedom from needing the world to behave exactly as we wish. Freedom from clinging to outcomes we cannot control. Freedom from losing ourselves in relationships that slowly drain our spirit. A man who reaches this point becomes incredibly powerful in his own life. Not because he dominates others, but because he finally masters himself. And when a man masters himself, something interesting happens. He becomes far more selective with who he allows into his world. He stops tolerating behavior that once felt normal. He stops over-explaining his boundaries. He stops sacrificing his peace just to keep someone comfortable. Instead, he begins building relationships based on mutual respect. And if that respect is not present, he no longer fights to force it. He simply walks away. Calmly. Quietly. Without drama. Because he understands something that every wise man eventually learns. Not every loss is a tragedy. Some losses are corrections. Corrections that remove people who could not see your worth while making space for people who will. But there is still one final twist in this story. Because sometimes, the moment a man truly begins choosing himself, is exactly when the woman who once overlooked him begins realizing what she may have lost. And that realization often arrives with a powerful emotion. Regret. Not because he became someone new, but because she finally sees the value that was there all along. And by then, the man she once took for granted may already be walking a completely different path. Love is a great lesson in maturity. It challenges us with fragility, teaches us patience through waiting, and gives us strength after being hurt. Here, I don't just tell stories for you to listen to, but for you to reflect on yourself and find your own lessons. If you find it valuable, please click like and subscribe, so you don't miss out on the shares that can change the way you look at love. Now, get ready with me, because the rest will have a lot more depth waiting for you. Part 4, when she finally realizes your value. But you're already gone. There is a moment in many relationships that arrives quietly, almost like a delayed echo. It does not happen while the relationship is still alive. It does not happen when you are still explaining yourself, still trying, still hoping things will improve. No. It often happens after you leave. After the silence settles. After the routine you once created disappears. After the space you once filled becomes empty. Only then does something begin to shift inside her mind. At first, the absence feels small. A few quiet days. A little less attention. A slight change in the rhythm of life. But the human mind is incredibly sensitive to emotional patterns. When a pattern that once existed suddenly disappears, the brain begins searching for it. It starts replaying memories. Moments she once ignored. Small gestures she once overlooked. Conversations that seemed ordinary at the time. And slowly, something begins to unfold. She begins to notice what you actually were. Not just the man who was there, but the man who supported her during difficult moments. The man who listened when she needed to talk. The man who showed patience when life became chaotic. The man who tried to create stability. The man who genuinely cared. But here is the irony of human nature. While those things were happening, they felt normal. But now, in hindsight, they begin to feel rare. Because the absence of something often reveals its true value. The Stoics understood this deeply. They practiced something called negative visualization. They imagined losing the things they loved in order to appreciate them more deeply while they still existed. But most people never practice this awareness. They assume that what exists today will still exist tomorrow. Until one day, it doesn't. And when that realization finally arrives, the emotional impact can be powerful. Because memories begin to change shape. Things that once felt ordinary now feel meaningful. Things that once felt predictable now feel irreplaceable. And sometimes, the mind begins to ask a painful question. Did I take him for granted? This question does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it takes weeks. Sometimes months. Sometimes even years. But when it finally arrives, it often brings a wave of realization. Because finding someone who is genuinely loyal, patient, and emotionally stable is not as common as people imagine. At first, many people believe they will easily find someone better. Someone more exciting. Someone more interesting. Someone who makes them feel something stronger. But over time, reality begins revealing something different. Excitement is easy to find. Attention is easy to find. Temporary attraction is easy to find. But consistent loyalty is rare. Emotional maturity is rare. A man who truly wants to build something meaningful is rare. And the more time passes, the clearer this becomes. Because the new connections she experiences may feel exciting at first. But excitement fades. And when excitement fades, character becomes visible. This is when comparison quietly begins. She remembers how calm you were during arguments. How you tried to resolve problems instead of creating more chaos. How you listened. How you supported her growth. How you stayed when things were difficult. And suddenly the man she once thought was ordinary begins to look very different. He begins to look valuable. But by this time, something important has already changed. You are no longer standing in the same place. Because walking away does something powerful to a man. It forces growth. It forces reflection. It forces self-discovery. When you step away from a relationship that once consumed your emotional energy, you suddenly gain something you did not have before. Clarity. You begin to see your life again. Your goals. Your ambitions. Your potential. You begin rebuilding the parts of yourself that were slowly fading. Your discipline. Your focus. Your independence. Your peace of mind. And the more you grow into this new version of yourself, the less you feel the need to return to the old dynamic. Because once a man experiences self-respect again, it becomes very difficult to return to a place where he felt undervalued. Not impossible, but difficult. This is one of the most misunderstood truths about relationships. People often assume that if they realize their mistake, everything can simply return to the way it once was. But life does not always work that way. Time changes people. Growth changes priorities. And sometimes, by the time someone recognizes your value, you have already moved forward emotionally. This does not mean you stopped caring. It simply means you started caring about your own life again. And that shift creates a new reality. Because the man who once gave endless chances is no longer the same man. He has learned something important. He has learned that love without respect slowly destroys self-worth. He has learned that patience without boundaries invites neglect. And he has learned that staying in the wrong place too long can cost years of personal growth. So when the moment finally arrives where she begins to understand what she lost, you may already be somewhere else in your life. Emotionally stronger, mentally clearer, and surrounded by new opportunities. Not because you wanted revenge. Not because you wanted to teach her a lesson. But because life kept moving. And you chose to move with it. This is where regret sometimes appears. Regret is not simply sadness. It is the painful awareness that something valuable existed, and was not appreciated when it mattered. But the Stoics remind us of something important. Regret is a teacher. It shows us where awareness was missing. It reveals the moments where we failed to recognize what truly mattered. And sometimes, regret becomes the beginning of personal growth. But for the man who walked away, the lesson is different. His lesson is about self-respect. About recognizing when his presence is not being valued. About understanding that love should not require constant self-sacrifice. And about learning that walking away is not always a failure. Sometimes it is the most powerful decision a man can make. Because leaving a place where you were not appreciated creates space for something far more meaningful. A life where your presence is not taken for granted. A life where your effort is respected. A life where the people around you recognize your value while you are still there. And that kind of life is worth walking away for. Part 5, the powerful lesson every man must learn about being valued. If there is one lesson that life eventually teaches every man, it is this. Your value is not determined by how someone treats you. It is determined by how you allow yourself to be treated. Many men spend years trying to become better partners. They learn to be patient. They learn to communicate. They learn to support the people they love. They try to build stability instead of chaos. And these are good qualities. They are honorable qualities. But somewhere along that path, many men forget something important. They forget that love should never require them to abandon themselves. Because the moment a man begins sacrificing his self-respect just to keep someone in his life, the relationship quietly becomes unbalanced. An imbalance slowly erodes appreciation. The Stoic philosophers believed that a man must always guard one thing above all else. His inner dignity. Not ego. Not pride. But dignity. Dignity is the quiet awareness that your character has value. That your time has value. That your loyalty has value. And that your presence should never be treated like something disposable. Unfortunately, many people only learn this lesson through pain. Through relationships where they gave too much. Through moments where they realized their effort was not reciprocated. Through the silence that follows walking away. But pain, when understood correctly, becomes wisdom. It becomes a teacher. And every man who has walked away from a place where he was not valued carries a deeper understanding of life. He understands that love without respect cannot survive. He understands that attraction without admiration fades quickly. And most importantly, he understands that being alone is far better than being slowly diminished in the presence of someone else. This is one of the most powerful realizations a man can have. Because the moment he stops fearing loneliness, something extraordinary happens. He becomes free. Free from chasing approval. Free from tolerating disrespect. Free from staying in places where his value is constantly questioned. This freedom transforms a man. He no longer tries to convince people of his worth. He simply lives in a way that reflects it. He invests in his growth. His discipline. His purpose. His health. His ambitions. his peace of mind. And the more he builds this life, the less he feels the need to chase validation from anyone. Ironically, this is also when people begin to see him differently. Because confidence that comes from inner stability is incredibly rare. Most people spend their lives seeking approval. But the man who has learned to stand firmly within himself carries a quiet strength that cannot be easily ignored. This is the essence of Stoic love. Stoic love is not cold. It is not distant. And it is not afraid of emotional connection. But it is grounded in something stronger than attachment. It is grounded in self-respect. A Stoic man loves deeply. But he never loses himself in the process. He gives loyalty. But he never allows loyalty to become self-destruction. He shows patience. But he never allows patience to become tolerance for disrespect. And if the day ever comes where the person beside him stops valuing what he brings into their life, he does not beg for recognition. He does not argue endlessly. He does not chase someone who no longer sees his worth. He simply does something many people struggle to do. He walks away. Not because he stopped caring, but because he started caring about something equally important: his own life. And here is the truth that many people eventually discover. The man who walks away with dignity often becomes unforgettable. Not because he tried to be mysterious. Not because he played emotional games. But because he carried something rare. Integrity. Stability. Emotional strength. And these qualities become far more visible once they are gone. This is why many women later realize the value of the man they once took for granted. Because in a world full of temporary attention and shallow connections, a man who offers real loyalty stands out. But loyalty must always walk beside self-respect. Without self-respect, loyalty becomes sacrifice. And sacrifice without appreciation becomes suffering. The Stoics would remind us that life is too short to spend years trying to convince someone to value you. Your time on this earth is limited. Your energy is precious. Your life is meant to be built, not slowly drained by relationships that fail to honor who you are. So the true lesson is not about making someone regret losing you. Revenge is small. Validation is temporary. The real lesson is about becoming the kind of man who never stays where he is not respected. The kind of man who understands his own worth without needing constant reassurance. The kind of man who walks through life with calm confidence, knowing that the right people will recognize his value naturally. Because the truth is simple. The world eventually reveals who appreciates you and who only tolerated your presence. And once you learn to recognize that difference, your life becomes far clearer. You stop chasing. You stop forcing connections. You stop holding on to people who cannot see what you bring into their lives. Instead, you move forward. Calmly. Quietly. With purpose. And somewhere along that path, you begin meeting people who treat your presence the way it should always have been treated. With respect. With gratitude. With appreciation. Because the right people do not need to lose you to understand your value. They recognize it while you are still there. And that is the kind of love that never requires you to walk away. Conclusion. In the end, the greatest lesson a man learns in love is not about how to hold on to someone. It is about knowing when to let go with dignity. Many men spend years trying to prove their worth. They give their time, their patience, their loyalty, and their emotional strength to someone they truly care about. They believe that if they love sincerely enough, if they try hard enough, eventually their value will be recognized. But life often teaches a harder truth. Not everyone will see your value while you are still standing beside them. Some people only recognize what you meant to their life after your presence disappears. After the messages stop. After the support is gone. After the quiet space you once filled becomes impossible to ignore. And by that time, something inside you has already changed. Because walking away from a place where you were not appreciated is not a loss, it is a transformation. It is the moment a man stops measuring his worth through someone else's attention and begins rebuilding it through his own character, discipline, and self-respect. This is the essence of Stoic love. To care deeply, but never abandon yourself. To give sincerely, but never beg to be valued. To love with loyalty, but always protect your dignity. And if someone realizes your value only after you leave, let that realization belong to them. Your journey is no longer about proving your worth. It is about becoming the kind of man who knows it, quietly, confidently, and without apology. Because the right people will never need your absence to understand your value. They will recognize it while you are still there. So today's video has ended. Thank you for taking the time to watch it all. I hope you have learned valuable lessons and these shares will help you on your love journey. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to receive more interesting content in the future. I'm very grateful for your support and see you again in the next videos. Wishing you all love and happiness.